I came back and our little gallery was full with a very distinguished looking group of Americans. And I just came in the door. I had told Angelika, having no practical business experience, my only suggestion was never accept an American private check without a reference. And Angelika was just saying to a very distinguished lady, very happy that you were interested in this Klimt drawing, but I need a reference for your check. And Mrs. Gertrude Mellon then responded very graciously, "Oh, I understand, dear, but you see, it's our bank, the Mellon Bank."
Presented by Arcata, the anti-fraud and customer due diligence network for the art world, The Bigger Picture presents a special series of episodes in partnership with London Art Week. A showcase of the best the art market has to offer, we take an inside look at the galleries participating and the stories behind the people that shape them. For almost half a century, Gallery Arnoldi-Livie has been dealing in European paintings, drawings and sculpture, having placed numerous important works in major international museums, and the gallery exhibits at TEFAF, Salon du Dessin and participates in London Art Week. Run by a husband and wife team, Bruce and Angelika, neither had visions or grand ideas of dealing in art were it not for their paths crossing as art history students on a rainy November day in Munich in 1968. Neither of you had family connections to art dealing starting out, yet coincidentally for both of you, your first experience with art that engages you, I suppose, intellectually and emotionally was actually in a museum. Angelika, tell us, what was it you saw in the Tate at 14 on a school trip, and how did it make you feel?
Well, I was sent to language school in the south of England, and we had one free day in London, and where we could do what we wanted. And I remember we hung around Trafalgar Square and didn't really know what to do. And I had heard about the Tate, not the National Gallery. And I said, let's go to the Tate. And that was a big name for 14-year-old girls. And we somehow got there, and right after the entrance, below the staircase in this nice vestibule, I saw the marble by Rodin, The Kiss. And I was so, right away, I was so overwhelmed and thought, my God, how beautiful art can be. And yeah, that was in a way my start. And frankly, I don't remember what else we looked at the Tate.
Wow, so that left its mark on your memory for sure.
Absolutely, sort of little girls, how should I say, imagination.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Bruce, of course, some 3,000 or more miles away at this point, on the other side of the world, growing up in Baltimore, you were making, if you will, pilgrimages to the Walters Gallery and the Museum of Art in Baltimore. Now, what was drawing you to museums back then, do you think?
Well, I realized very early on, I think age 13, that whatever intelligence I have goes over my eyes, through my eyes. I am not don't have an abstracting mentality. In other words, I was terrible in most maths, but I was pretty good in geography because I see maps. In fact, it was very clear that anything that is an abstraction or a formula, I couldn't get involved with or remember. But anything that that evoked visual associations was something that I could latch on to right away. And I do remember somehow I got myself, age 14, I think also, to the Walters Gallery in Baltimore, which, as you know, is essentially a private collection with as much sculpture and decorative arts as paintings. And sculpture was very important there too. And I remember being fascinated by the modello in wax and painted wax of Queen Marie Antoinette's jewelry case. It's actually a large piece of furniture. This was the modello for it. And why should an adolescent boy take an interest in something like this? It was just such a totally original conception, as a piece of furniture, and I couldn't see enough of it. And then my eyes wandered on, and I looked at about everything, including the classical antiquities, and it simply was my the visual stimulus was my world, and I realized that. And I thought, why not cultivate it? But it's something very difficult to communicate to one's parents, for instance. One's parents see results from school in the form of grades, and my grades were always so lopsided. Language is fine, and everything but natural science and math.
So more to do with the way you actually found you viewed the world and the things that kind of appealed to you in school.
Precisely, yeah. And I do believe in one's own family one can observe this. We have two sons. And the oldest son, although an engineer, he graduated in engineering from the ETH in Zurich, which is a very tough technical school. He's very visual. And now he has a gallery in Zurich. Which perhaps mention again a bit later, but he's extremely visual and always was. His younger brother, no less intelligent, great in languages. He learned Arabic, for instance. Very much very verbal, great debater, and so forth. He isn't particularly visual, and within the one's own family. So there you have it.
Importantly, it draws a distinction, of course, between the difference in people, and what you're actually touching upon here is a thread that we've seen throughout working on these podcasts, and this series in particular, with participants in London Art Week, is inherently the mind is geared towards the visual side, and of course it's a tremendous asset given the nature of the job, the business.
Precisely, it's very true. I won't say that I never forget an image. That would be vainglorious and not true. But somehow it's all up there. And I do remember having terrible times trying to concentrate on certain subjects in the classroom, while my mind was just wandering through associations, generally visual. I did fine in French and French literature and Latin, actually. That's not particularly relevant. But it's the eyes, the visual stimulus.
That's so interesting. And Gaelic, now you actually cite your uncle, a sculptor, as being, I suppose, one of your earliest influences. How did your relationship with him help you develop your relationship with art more broadly after that experience at the Tate?
Well, this was very early on. In fact, I grew up in a small town in the Inn Valley in Upper Bavaria. And I should add, it's a very pretty valley, and there are several artists who built houses there before and after the war. And one of them was my uncle. And I remember it was a sort of modernistic, simple, rustic house where he had his studio. And of course, I loved to go there. It was a different, I wouldn't say bohemian, but into this direction atmosphere. And one talked about art all the time. He tried to teach me, but he also took my interest seriously. And same with Bruce. In my family, they were not against it, but it was not a deep interest as it was in this household. So I was very attracted by it, and it influenced me a lot.
Yeah, I suppose all you can do really is follow things that actually appeal to you and that attract you or stimulate you intellectually or emotionally. And it must have been very interesting at such an early age to be able to explore those avenues through your uncle and see that what I imagine would have been a completely different world.
A different world. You're so right, and that's what influences you more than anything. And at home, okay, I was a very happy child or a young girl, an only child, but there it was really interesting. the talks, the people that came by, different world, and so I thought I think it grew on me then that this might be a direction to go, and my uncle noticed that as well, and and tried to sort of enforce it.
One of the things that's becoming quite interesting, and almost a pattern that we've started to discover as we have these conversations, these podcasts, is of course that the connection the dealer has to art starts almost as a parallel journey with the formal education that one receives at school, because the schooling system almost doesn't seem to quite place the same emphasis, or indeed parents don't quite place the same emphasis or importance. So it's down to the individual that's attracted and can't help but be drawn in that direction. And it's through these experiences that you're describing.
Like so many writers whose parents forced them to take law once they went to university. And I think there's so many examples of that.
Not unsurprisingly, of course, though, these early experiences set you on a course, with you both satiating your appetite for art with academic studies. As a gallery, throughout your history, the emphasis on academia and scholarship is evident. Indeed, your personal library is somewhat legendary. So it should come as no surprise, therefore, with you both having masters in art history. So, Bruce, you embark on your studies at Yale as a freshman. What was your plan at that point after graduating?
Well, the plan was a bit vague and was very influenced by this professor, Robert Bailey, who in fact was a musicologist, not an art historian. And although a young man, he was the American expert on German 19th century. I mean, he was a thoroughly trained musicologist in every way, but he had concentrated on the 19th century and especially Richard Wagner. So through him, I became a great fan of Wagner and Richard Strauss and the classic 19th century musical literature. But Wagner is obviously a very interesting character in every way. But I had parallel interests in literature at the time, and that's the great advantage of the American general studium generale system, that you can indulge your interests and sort of feel your way forward. And I wrote my senior thesis on Wagner and Proust, because Proust was a great admirer of Wagner, and I think that I had a theory, still maintain this, that Proust based his novel initially, the structure of it, à la recherche du temps perdu, on the ring cycle, as with a tetralogy with an introductory piece, the Rheingold, and only the First World War came, and then the central section of Albertine was expanded. And it was a very deep subject for a senior in college to take on, needless to say. But it was allowed, and I was not ridiculed before. And I had this whole broad, sort of a very broad set of experiences. But I did realize that this visual aspect was taking me the farthest. And I had a seminar in sophomore year with a professor, an art historian, very important fellow, named George Hurd Hamilton, who was the first American, and perhaps the first person generally, to go to Soviet Russia in the 1930s to research Russian constructivism. He wrote the first book on the subject, as far as I know. And he was a wonderful man. This was he was shortly before retirement, and he invited this little seminar to his house, and there were several Matisses hanging in the dining room. And I of course I saw this right away and congratulated him on his pictures. He said, "Oh, if you only knew what I once had, but almost every second semester, we have 5 sons, you see. I had to sacrifice a painting to pay for their education, and this is what's left." Yale was a wonderful place, I must say, and you were indulged if you were serious. And I took all sorts of subjects that I like, anthropology and geology, things, and I'm very, very grateful. But at the end, you ask about when I came down to a decision. This Professor Bailey asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, well, I think I'll go to Paris. I really want to spend a year in Paris. And he said, no, don't do that. Everybody does that. It's very commonplace now. You go to Germany because your interests tend to be Germanic. And he was right, Central European at least. He anticipated that somehow. And I said, well, where should I go? And on the auspices, he said, there's a very good scholarship that you can apply for from the German government, which was the German equivalent of the Fulbright. And I said, well, my German is so poor. How can I do that? I said, well, I'll testify that your German is fluent and you can learn it on the boat going over. And indeed, one took a boat from Manhattan docks to Bremerhaven in 6 days on the SS Hanseatic. And I arrived in Germany and I chose Munich instead of Berlin. And the story, as you know, is that we met that fall semester standing in front of a rainy, snowy facade of the castle, of the palace here, the residence. And I thought, I'm not going to catch pneumonia by standing around here looking at this facade that I could study from photos. So I crept out of the group, and who was behind me but Angelika Arnoldi, and we both sort of met at the door of a local cafe, and we had a coffee together.
Warm.
Very cold and unpleasant November day.
Yeah, I mean, we fast forwarded a little bit there, but if we can, I'd like to just return to Angelika, where you were obviously in Paris while Bruce was stateside, thinking about going over to Munich, as you've just described. Your studies, you were actually you were under the tutelage of Professor Joseph Eisenworth. How did his teaching influence or challenge your thinking?
Well, Schmoll genannt Eisenwert, he was a professor at the Polytechnical University in Munich, and I was inscribed at the Ludwig Maximilians University. And there, the emphasis was more on Italian Renaissance, early Netherlandish. It was a very good place to study, but somehow I heard about Schmoll genannt Eisenwert that he did more modern things. And I went over and listened to his first lecture, to my first lecture there, which was on the urban development of Paris, because he had to teach architects there. And yeah, his style of lecturing was wonderful. He was a great speaker. And then I informed myself what else he did, and it was French 19th century, first Courbet and the realist movement, and sculpture, because he was a really great Rodin expert. Sculpture was a big theme, so I could come to his seminar, and it was a seminar on early 20th century sculpture, and of course, he taught Brancusi, and that was already the time where you had to think of a thesis, and I liked Brancusi very much, of course. And he said, well, nothing has been done on the drawings yet. Why don't, if you like, why don't you do that? And of course, this was wonderful for me. And it led to a scholarship in Paris, which he also helped to organize. In fact, it was the same scholarship Bruce had, the DAAD, which was at that time easy to get. And
I guess so.
So I went to Paris, and he gave me introductions to the Musée d'Art Moderne, where the Brancusi studio was still located, and the Brancusi archive. And I was allowed to work there and started to collect everything about Brancusi's drawings. And of course, I met other people through that, and it remained, how should I say, important to me, and was also helpful for art dealing later.
Let's move forward now back to the moment in time that you were referring to moments ago, Bruce, where your paths would, of course, cross, because as of this year, you've shared a life and a business together for 48 years. Did cast your mind back to that rainy November day? Did either of you, do you think, see early on that your futures would be intertwined in some way?
Well, I certainly was open to suggestions, but my whole thrust at that point was to go into museum work. And that's why I applied to the Fogg Museum at Harvard, because at that time, this was the one training ground for young curators. This was actually a stated program of theirs, and there is still a German collection there called the Busch-Reisinger collection, and I attached myself to that while I was there, and did research, some research there, and did a little exhibition on Dürer and his influence on the decorative arts. And it was a wonderful pickup sort of thing. I remember renting a VW and driving around New England, picking up the loans, and no one discussed insurance. It was already something that I had some packing material with me. And I did this little exhibition with a catalog, and that ultimately got me my master's degree. But I was going to go into museum work, and Angelika, on the other hand, under various influences, was coming around to the idea of going into the art trade. And I shouldn't perhaps speak too fast about this, but
no, I think.
But it's Angelika who got me into this business, because she put together a group of very fine things, which she borrowed from different sources among people she knew, and we started a little gallery in the Maximilianstrasse across from the opera here. And I thought, oh well, give it 6 months, and then this particular spleen will pass, and we'll do something serious.
So, of course, I think the period of time we're almost looking at now is 1970, the very early 1970s. And, of course, you've described here this connection, because Angelika, I believe you actually accompanied your uncle on a trip to New York where he was to be exhibiting some of his work. And it was while you were there, I suspect, that you would meet a particularly important American dealer and his wife. Help us understand, how would they become significant to you and Bruce, and opening up your gallery?
It was Serge Zabarsky and his wife, Wally Zabarsky. And Serge had opened a gallery, I think in 1970, on Madison Avenue. He was an architect before that, but had collected Schiele and German Expressionism in his career before. No, he collected it in New York.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And I walked by his gallery while I was in New York with my uncle, and saw an exhibition of Klimt drawings. And I entered, and he was there. There was nobody else there, and we started talking. And I knew a little bit of Klimt, but it was fantastic to see a whole exhibition there. And well, it developed very nicely, and he asked me home, and I saw his collection there. And then he even asked me if I would sort of work for him a little bit in Munich, because he had business in Munich, but he needed somebody to get, how should I say, to deepen the conversations with some people he knew. And that was a great job for me. And I remember he said, why don't you go to the gallery Gunzenhauser, who also was a great art dealer in Munich. And don't tell him you're looking for Kokoschka. Just ask him for posters and start the conversation. and, and Alfred Gunzenhauser told me years later, he said, I remember so well when you came in, asked for posters. I noticed right away there was something behind it. But it led to the fact that Sabarsky and Gunzenhauser did very good business together. And so I've got into this world a little bit. And the other influence, which again was through my uncle, was a gentleman called Wilhelm F. Arns, an older, then already older Anwalt.
Expert, what was it? What,
Yeah, he was a
he was a lawyer
he
by
was a lawyer
training.
by training, but had a huge archive on 20th century art. And the archive now is, in fact, in the Getty Museum. That was his hobby, so to speak. But he also did catalogs for Roman Norbert Ketterer in Stuttgart. He was their expert. And we got to know him, and he really took us under his arms. And for our first or second exhibition, he gave us wonderful things. And I think we talk about that exhibition later.
Yeah, I was just curious to know, what do you think Serge and Wally saw in you, and saw them you support you in that way when you were starting out? What do you think they saw in you?
Yeah, and being German, well, I think first of all it was my interest for the art they collected and loved, and then maybe because I was a young German, and of course they had terrible memories, and I was of course interested to hear their stories, but I was very careful about it, and it took a while till they told me, and I mean, it was great to hear it all. And I think they felt, okay, this is a new generation, and maybe we shouldn't be as anti-German as we thought we would be all our lives. They were very open then, and then Serge started. That's why he wanted me to do things in Munich for him. Started to come to Germany a lot, and he found a lot in here. Yeah.
And he also, this was our entree, one of our entrees to that German diaspora among, in every major city. There were these wonderful, fascinating people who had fled at some point in the 1930s and reestablished themselves. And we had in the 70s, we had an amazing Rolodex card file of German emigre colleagues, all elderly colleagues, but fascinating stories. And what would emerge then, that they didn't consider themselves as German emigre group. They still consider themselves to be Berliners, Münchner, Frankfurters, Hamburgers, Cologne. They still actually lived in the world they had left, and they loved to speak German with us because they could then speak their native language, and often somewhat dialect, and we learned enormously. You just take a lot of 20th century history out of that too.
Of course. And this kind of takes us to a point in time now, around 1972, where you opened your gallery together. And while you've got the academic credentials, and this has clearly been something that Serge has certainly seen in you, amongst other things, you are starting from scratch with no clients, presumably no works of art to sell. So what did you do?
Well, the Wilhelm F. Arns, whom I mentioned, he gave us a group of very consigned. Yeah, we didn't have, we had a little bit of money, but not much. But he consigned a group of beautiful drawings to us. I remember Schlemmer, Corinth, Kokoschka, and so on. And you want to tell the story when our first visitors?
we had our first show was really rather good stuff, mainly expressionist and secessionist things. And we'd actually spent as much time trying to make our own frames, which was absurd because neither of us has any particular practical gift for this. But we were quite content with the way it all looked. And we thought someone might come. I came back and our little gallery was full with a very distinguished looking group of Americans. And I just came in the door. I had told Angelika, having no practical business experience, my only suggestion was never accept an American private check without a reference. And Angelika was just saying to a very distinguished lady, I'm very happy that you're interested in this Klimt drawing, but I need a reference for your check. And Mrs. Gertrude Mellon then responded very graciously, "Oh, I understand, dear, but you see, it's our bank, the Mellon Bank." And it turned out that this group was were trustees of the Museum of Modern Art, and they were traveling in Europe. And a very lovely colleague named Margaret Biedermann, who had a gallery, an established gallery around the corner, suggested that they visit us.
And she was related to Walter Bareis.
And she was related to Walter Bareis, a Yale alumnus, a German-American Yale alumnus, great collector living in Greenwich, Connecticut, who also influenced us very much in our early days. And it was a key moment in our launch, no question about it. And I ran into Mrs. Mellon some years later at the opera, at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And she sort of giggled and said, "I remember you." And I remember having to defend my check. So things came together. I mean, it was never that easy afterward, but at least one had contacts, you know, and also in New York, and just one thing led to another.
And of course, you mentioned earlier, of course, that you actually thought this would all peter out after around 6 months. What made you think that would be the case?
Well, I thought that, you know, realistically, exactly how can a tender plant grow without proper soil? And I don't think that we had. I just didn't trust the good Lord to give us everything we needed, and it was establishing a new business. But I have to say, in those days, it was, I wouldn't say easier, but it was less fraught with difficulties because people were quite happy to work with us. And I think we got a good track record. And there was such general interest in the things we had, which alas, now is less so. Because, as you know, the focus has shifted so much. But we had a good start. We've had a very good run, if you like. I won't complain.
Angelika, Bruce cites the fact that you simply won't give up as being an attribute that has been useful to you in business. How important do you think that was to you both when you were starting out?
Yeah, probably I wasn't really aware of it when we started out. It developed probably somewhat later, but I think it's a little bit in my nature. When I think, okay, you have to call so and so, I do it and then follow up on things. And Bruce is still laughing about the fact we were in New York, and through my studies with Brancusi, I met Sidney Geist, who was an early expert on Brancusi, and we became great friends. And he gave me a number of telephone numbers to call people who had drawings by Brancusi. And I looked through the list, and one was Mrs. Watson, and I dialed. I had no idea whom I was calling, and
The butler answered.
the butler answered and said, one moment, please. And very nice lady came to the phone and said, yeah, I have this drawing, and I'm in the country now, but if you're here next week, you can come and see it in the city. And that was all very kind, and I did. And Bruce said, do you know who this Mrs. Watson is? And I said, no, I have no idea. And you said, she's the wife of the founder of IBM.
You can imagine the palazzo in Greenwich or wherever you know. But I'm totally unfazed.
And I think to this day, if I sort of know of something, then, and there's a way to get to it, I will pick up the phone and try to have a conversation.
But very politely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not
Politely knock on doors.
yes, absolutely, absolutely.
No, she just doesn't give up on projects. I tend to sort of shrug my shoulders and say, fate just doesn't want this to happen. And Angelika believes very strongly in correcting fate.
Over your nearly half a century in the art world running your gallery, and you were touching on this already, you've made countless lifelong friends, and subsequently you've been able to share your passion with others. By way of example, Bruce, you cite the late great American dealer and past president of the Art Dealers Association of America, Eugene Victor Thor, as having been influential to you. How was he significant in your life?
Well, in fact, we didn't do that much business with Gene, although there was business, especially with the group that he put together in London called Artemis, based on the capabilities of a man named David Carrot, who had started out in his career as a porter at Christie's and worked his way up to one of the great experts in old master paintings. And this was a group of very experienced art dealers. Gene stayed in New York, but there was the back and forth. And these were the great days, the heady days of the old master trade in London and New York. And I visited Gene as a Harvard student, as a Fogg student of art history, when he was not starting out, but I think he was still in his first gallery. And it rather resembled what we have now here, you know. And he was very kind, and Gene was never a great conversationalist, but he was quite happy to explain things to us and explain his position on these things. And of course, as we all know, this career soared over time in New York and America, and he had some of the greatest American clients of his day, and Norton Simon being one of the most difficult men in the world, probably. But Gene could actually tame him and deal with him. And I overheard one conversation, it was quite something, where essentially Gene turned the thing around and said, Norton, you have to decide now. And I don't think that was often the sort of conversation that was held with that man. At any rate, Gene, of course, was a great collector. And his collection's now gone essentially to the Morgan, some things, important things, to the Metropolitan. And then Gene set up some things in upstate New York and in New Mexico. He had an amazing panoply of interests as well. And a person like this you cannot help but be impressed by. And we'll never have his degree of success, if you like. But he's somebody I like to hold point out as an exemplar of what our profession can be. You see, and I think his particular love of drawings was very sympathetic. to me, and I've learned a great deal from his actual collection and the several publications, several catalogs that Morgan has done, for instance. You know, and I believe very strongly in my profession as the one that cultivates our material inheritance. You know, and museums do that too, but in a different way. But we're on the ground, so to speak. You know, and we deal with the public in a different way, and we deal with things in a different way. And I think we have, I simply, judging from what we've done and how many things we place with museums and with private collections that feed into museums, I believe very strongly that we have a role to play as professional art dealers.
To what do you attribute your success?
Well, I mean, success. You know, I wouldn't consider us.
Yeah, we wouldn't.
We're not filthy rich, and we are not never achieve the flight of someone like Eugene Thaw. But at the same time, we've lived very well from our little existence here, and we've not had to do without anything essential, nor our sons, and we were able to educate them, and they've taken off and are doing very well, I think. I think it's something, the love of the things. I know that sounds rather doe-eyed and sentimental, but it really comes down to that. And sometimes we succeed in communicating our love of the thing to someone else.
Not always.
Angelika, you referenced Helen Serger as being significant in your life. How did her role as a pioneer presenting works of women artists influence you?
Well, again, I met her through Serge Zabarsky, as I met her, but also other sort of female peer pioneers. There was Dorothea Iserstadt, who had the Karus Gallery. She dealt a lot in Beckmann, or Eleanor Seidenberg. She was the Picasso dealer for America. She was connected with Kahnweiler, and also Helen Serger. And yes, Helen did exhibitions of female artists like Sonia Delaunay or Hannah Höch, and they are great artists, and I love them. But I must say it was not so much the female aspect that interested me. It was simply good art. But of course, I was impressed that ladies could, or women could do serious art dealing, and they were wonderful examples, and probably that gave me courage to do this, to try it also.
Bruce, Angelika describes you as having an intense approach with respect for looking for something. Now, we kind of touched on this already, and this is, I think, your propensity to see things and approach things in a visual way. Not unsurprisingly, as a gallery, you, of course, made numerous important discoveries and have placed works, as you've already alluded to, in major institutions internationally. Tell us about the work by Dürer that you would sell to the Getty and how you found it.
That was a funny June. That in that month, a child was born. In that month, we moved house, and it was just a topsy-turvy moment.
And we had bought a fake,
that's
which
right.
cost us a lot of money.
Right. I had succumbed to a fake. It was a brilliant setup in Madrid. Someone had overheard my saying that I would love to find Cubist drawings, Cubist studies, you know. And lo and behold, somebody appeared in our gallery and said, "I have just what you want. A carnet of studies by Juan Gris, with a noble woman in Madrid." And it was a brilliant setup, and I fell for it. And on the plane coming back, the scales fell from my eyes, and I realized that I'd been had. But by that time, I had invested a large chunk of our capital. And then along comes this conversation or the telephone call from it was Mr. Arnst, who had nothing to do with Dürer or the German Renaissance. You know, he was a man of the 20th century, and he said very jocularly, "Bruce, what would you think if I said to you that I have a Dürer drawing?" And I said, "Dürer drawing?" And I said, "Ha ha." And I thought, don't be too flip about this. Inquire. But I'd like to see it, Mr. Arnst. Well, then come visit and I'll show it to you. And it was indeed a wonderful, important drawing of actually a model on a cross, something for working toward a crucifixion scene. The only trouble was there was a second version of it in Leningrad that had been taken from the Dresden collections and not returned. And so I couldn't compare it directly with that to decide which was the better drawing. Ultimately, it was determined that ours was the better version, the stronger version. And I simply went with it to to Berlin, to London, and Paris to compare with and Nuremberg with the Dürer drawings there, and then I could present it. And it was when I was in Berlin, I ran into a gentleman named Goldner, George Goldner, who was simply in Berlin, I think, looking at drawings in the cabinet. And he got wind of this. I said, "What do you have?" And I said, "Well, let's have lunch and we can discuss it." You know, and he had just become curator of drawings of a non-existent collection at the Getty. He then bought, I remember, one Rembrandt drawing in red chalk, and then had a little sign made for his door: "Keeper of the drawing." This is how it all began, in embossed leather. And so I had drawing with me. And I remember, you know, Berlin, especially in those days, was not a culinary capital. And we ended up in a place off of the Fürstendamm, where actually one got, they call them bouletten, but hamburgers. And I remember setting my drawing up against a mustard pot to show it to George. And ultimately it went there, of course. And that was, compensated for what we had lost with the fake Juan Gris, and was our first major sale of an important old master drawing. And they've published it, and I think they're still quite happy with it.
Wow. Let's fast forward to 2006 and discuss another one of your important works. You found yourself, in this instance, standing, I suppose, shoulder to shoulder with Christie's for the opportunity to sell a work by Menzel, which you ultimately did to the National Gallery in London. How did you achieve this? Tell us about this.
Well, I think it was in 2005 that I heard about this restitution case in Dresden. Another art historian had told me, you know, I'm afraid they will lose their Menzel. And one of them, but their important Menzel, the Tuileries Garden. Well, you're right, they also have other important one. And somehow I thought I should get to Dresden and find out more about it.
This option.
And there was an exhibition, and I didn't know how to approach the subject, but then I talked to the curator, and I dared to say, I have heard that this might be the case. And he said, yes, it's terrible, and it's a fact. Our minister has signed the letter that we have to return it. And there's not much we can do. And I said, well, but isn't it, and how is it going to be? And he said, well, it will be auctioned. And I said, but wouldn't it be a better idea if a dealer got it and sold it to another museum, and then you could make arrangements with the museum and maybe get for loans, and it wouldn't be lost somewhere unknown. And he liked that idea, and he simply gave me the telephone number of the organization in Dresden who did this restitution case. And while I was there, I called, I went there, I described my case, and they said, but do you have the money? And because we need to sell it. And of course, we didn't have the money, but we knew then Alfred Bader quite well. And I called him, and he said, well, tell them what they want, and tell me what they want. And then we did the deal, and it went to the National Gallery. And unfortunately, Dresden was not so happy about it afterwards. I don't know why, but the then director very kindly made a loan right after a year later for a Menzel exhibition in Dresden, and it worked like that. And now it's in the National Gallery and looks wonderful.
No, it is. It was a wonderful moment for I think for the National Gallery. The curator, still there, Chris Riopel, I think would agree with me. Still, it's a largish picture, as with Menzel, always lots of figures. The Tuileries Garden in the Napoleon III time. And of course, they have the great Manet of the Tuileries Garden, entirely different approach, almost the same year. So you could really see a Germanic view of Paris and a Parisian view, you know, and compare. And the Menzel is in impeccable condition, which is so rarely the case with the larger pictures. You know, and I must say, it's one of my ever recurring pleasures when I'm in the Trafalgar Square area to just hop to the National Pop In and have a look again at those two pictures, and others as well, of course. But
yeah, and Chris Riopel was a wonderful partner.
He was-
You
he
simply
owns it.
called, and
Yeah.
he knew what you were talking about.
Yeah,
And,
that's true. Yeah.
When you just described there, you know, hopping in a cab and heading over to the National to see the Menzel, what goes through your mind, either of you, when you stand opposite a work and you think we've had a hand in helping that find its home here, so that the world at large, the art appreciating public, can enjoy it, as opposed to it being put behind lock and key? What goes through your mind?
Well, you know, there is this dichotomy that's always cited between public and private. And of course, in America, it doesn't really work that way, because the private collectors often or generally work together with curators. This is the genius of the American system of private foundations, in that the curators are encouraged to go out and cultivate collectors in their area of expertise. And that's how these collections often grow. I remember a wonderful photo of Paul Mellon, who was always adopting museums and helping them, having established, of course, the great Mellon collection at Yale. And the National Gallery, of course, was his family's creation. And finally, he was helping the museum in Richmond at the end of his life. And the wonderful photo of arm in arm, so Paul Mellon with a recently appointed trustee who was an air conditioning magnate locally, and was giving money to the museum. You know, and that was the equivalent of the Queen, a knighthood in effect. You know, in the American system. And these people give things, then you sell something to a private person, and very often it ends up in the museum. So you have to try to you have to think on two levels. What does this person want? What is this person collecting? And secondly, is it of sufficient museum quality? And that's always saved us because we've never been so gifted somehow living in Munich, I guess, as opposed to a great metropolis. We've had fewer private collectors than we have had museum clients all along. I won't say that we don't make an effort, but somehow as art historians, we can go to a museum and see what they don't have, see what we think they should have, and then sort of working around that idea, perhaps something can happen. You know?
I think that's key, actually, what you've just described there. I think that's key for your business, as the way you've summarised that.
Very much so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Angelika, curiously, you know, in our notes here, I can see that you've actually said that you'd like to have experienced the auction world, actually, before plunging into dealing. How do you think that may have influenced your approach to the business of art?
Well, I often thought, because as we were telling now, we started sort of from nothing and with very little experience. And I think would I do it again, I would probably try to work for a big auction house beforehand, or I would advise people to do so. I think you get a more realistic view on things, and also you make more contacts in a different way. But on the other hand, maybe it would not have led to what we did. It's hard to tell.
Exactly, the path not taken.
Yeah, but the lack of realism, if you speak to an somebody who works in an auction house, he thinks differently and he knows what sells these days and what doesn't. And we never thought that way. And maybe it would have helped to do both. Yeah.
Bruce, you have a motto: we live from what we know. Share with us, what do you mean by this?
Well, I mean, to put it another way, we live by our wits. We did not inherit a going concern, and at the same time, we couldn't afford to just go out with gun shooting and buy expensive things at auction as much as we would have liked to. But at the same time, we wanted to have as wares, we want to have the best that we could afford and pull in. So this keeps you on your toes, so to speak. You know, and that's and it's also I like to say that our form of art dealing is like an ongoing art historical seminar. We're never sitting back and saying, well, I know all about that. You're always confronted with new objects, and you have to ask yourself those basic questions: authenticity, condition, now provenance, terribly important, provenance, and desirability. You know, how typical is it of the artist? Is it a good day or a bad day? You know, and all these things. It's the same process, if you like, but it's always something different. You know, so I like to think that we have both lived and not lived rather nicely these many years through our, well, whatever gifts we were given, and through the eyes that we have honed over time. And you do acquire experience, and you have. I now can enter an auction viewing, a large viewing, and more or less filter out just about everything except the one or two things. And I've always said to my son before entering one of those viewings, say to yourself, there's a pearl here somewhere. You know, never allow yourself, because there's usually an awful lot of rubbish and mediocrity, but there is something here, you know, and look at everything. You know, and this often, or has often resulted in finding something that just escaped attention.
You've of course mentioned your son there, who has actually opened his own gallery with his fiancée in Zurich. How different does the business of dealing in art now seem in comparison to the way it was in 1968?
Oh my God, it's a different world. And yeah, and of course the shift from old art to modern or contemporary art is so visible, and they are more into contemporary art. Not that they're not interested in classic modern, but I think this will be their world. And I mean, everything is digital, everything is transparent. Um, when we started, even when you bought something at a sale and it was a discovery, nobody knew what you paid for it. And when it was a good discovery, you could make some money. That is almost not possible anymore. So, but with them, I think they have how should I say, a similar approach to us. Go for the special things, and but the whole, what is so more difficult these days, I find that the art trade is mostly concentrated on auctions, and in our days I think the dealer played a more important role. But for us dealers, we can discover things at auctions because they are now, when we started, it was a small group of experts sitting in an auction room and other dealers, and that was it. And now the auction houses, they are only or mostly interested in private people, and it's more a lifestyle thing, so to speak. And how our son and Marie, his fiancée, yeah, they will have to cope with that, and but they will.
The great advantage for them is that there are many younger collectors eager to find things and to have visual experiences. And this is where, as the Americans would say, this is where the action is now. And fine, this is a fact, a sort of socio-cultural shift. I remember so well a German museum director saying to me, he was so fed up being plagued by artists from the local art academy, saying to him, "Why don't you exhibit us? Why don't you?" And he would always say, "I wait until the picture is dry before I exhibit it in my museum." These days he couldn't say that. He'd have to say he'd have to take everything right off the easel, if he wanted a public. And this is indicative of how it's shifted. And we are art historians. We simply grew up with older art and drawings, and we are not ashamed of the fact. But at the same time, we're very proud to have a son, an engineer who was in industries in Zurich for 10 years before he finally decided he just, the apple didn't fall far enough from the tree. He wanted his own gallery. And he's got it, and more power to him. And because he's collected contemporary all along. Their flat in Zurich is full of contemporary art that they know very much about. And this is the next generation.
Mm. When you think about that, you describe that social-cultural shift. When you think about the future of your gallery, what goes through your mind?
Well, I think, yes, we're going to, I think our objective is a gentle inconclusive conclusion. We'll go on for a while still and very happily do it. But it's not something that, it's like a restaurant that can't be passed on. Because the cooks you want or need do other cuisines. And I think one thing you mentioned, our library. I did catch our two sons standing in the library at home, looking around, saying, "What are we going to do with this one fine day?" You know,
Yeah.
I mean, things come to a natural end. And,
Yeah. However, I mean, Marie and Caspar are helping. We wouldn't be talking if Marie hadn't organized the London Art Week
Yes.
digital presentation. They help us a lot there, and I think we would be completely forgotten if it weren't for them to.
Well, it certainly helps. Yeah,
to-
yeah.
And they do exhibitions in Munich as well. And we tried to mix old and new. And I have to say that it wasn't overwhelming, but it worked in an
Yeah.
interesting way. And I hope we will continue a
Well,
little
yes,
bit.
that's great fun. We'll see how that can be developed. Casper, our son, is a Swiss citizen now, and they will certainly stay in Zurich. They like Zurich. At the same time, I like to point out to them, all our Munich friends from the day one here, what did they collect? Contemporary, not our old curiosity shop things. And now those collections are classic. So I very much recommend to my son, who does it, to take tea in Munich with various friends and associates, and find things here. Because Munich was a great collecting town for the contemporary scene, starting with our Prince, now Duke of Bavaria, who continued in a great Wittelsbach tradition of art collecting. And he put together in the 60s and 70s and 80s a fantastic collection, which is now all on loan, public loan. And he set the pace essentially for the private collecting here in southern Bavaria, and it was quite considerable.
I know we've kind of touched, of course, on this change in taste, but something you've already touched on there is, of course, that all art is essentially contemporary at one time or another. But if you consider old masters generally, let's think about that as a discipline, if you will. How does that those works coming from a finite supply actually prolong the longevity of the work in that sense, the commercial potential for it?
Well, rarity is something that I'm particularly amused when I hear from my son speaking of the great rarity of certain works by contemporary living artists. You know? And I suppose the things can be just as rare in the contemporary world as they are in with older art. But rarity is a dangerous concept too, because I know from prior experience, whenever I buy something because of its rarity, and I say, well, this just is not going to come around again, then suddenly the artist's estate comes on the market. You know? From some obscure French or Italian source. You know? And then you just have one of a number. You know.
To both of you, with the benefit of experience, if you could go back and give yourself, at the start of your journey, advice, what would it be?
I think we made several mistakes, but one mistake was because we had started our gallery in a time where there were very good contemporary galleries in Munich, Galerie Friedrich and so on, where all our friends bought things. And somehow we wanted to be different and didn't. And I think economically that was a mistake, but also we should have looked at it more closely.
Yeah. We did, but you were better at it than I was. But at the same time, we wanted to define ourselves in a different direction.
But I think you should always do both. Look at older art and contemporary at the same time, and vice versa. And that's what we try to teach our son Caspar, and he does.
Yes, it's true. No, he has a very good eye, I must say, generally. He doesn't have quite the tolerance I have for Christian iconography, for instance. Martyrdom scenes, Neapolitan.
I don't either.
Well, she's Protestant.
That's not the reason.
But I think that perhaps it wasn't a mistake, but it was almost an inevitability. In that we did always emphasize our love of drawings, and that's probably what we mostly advertise. People associate us to this day with drawings exclusively, and actually we've lived as much from paintings as from drawings. And I'm always hearing when we exhibit in Maastricht, oh, you have paintings. We're in the pictura section after all. But it's somehow one is pegged in the public mind very quickly. And drawings, there is this quite ridiculous hierarchy, and of course painting is the prime phenomenon, and drawing is somewhat subordinate. Of course, it's not borne out by auction records. I mean, these days, very often, a drawing is more valuable than the painting by the same artist.
Thank you for listening. You can follow and subscribe to The Bigger Picture wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about this episode or to reach out to us directly, please visit arcarta.com.